Hi everyone, my name's Adrian Tam. I'm a follower of Jesus and I have one wife and 3 kids. I'm also a pastor of a church here in Sydney, Australia, and I get to also alongside that lead a great ministry called Faith Tech, which is all about bridging the gap between the Christian faith and the tech industry.
Welcome to Faithly Stories, the podcast that brings you inspiring tales from conversations with church leaders as they navigate the peaks and valleys of their faith journeys through their ministry work and everyday life. Join us as we delve into their challenges, moments of encouragement, and answered prayers. The Faithly Stories podcast is brought to you by Faithly, an online community committed to empowering church leaders, pastors, staff, and volunteers. Learn more at faithly.co. Get ready to be uplifted and inspired as we unveil the heart of faith through stories from the front lines of ministry on the Faithly Stories podcast.
Thank you so much, Adrian. I am just so happy to be having this conversation with you. I feel like we've been planning to have it for several months now, but I've got 3 kids. You've got 3 kids. Yeah. I wear multiple hats in multiple ministries, and so do you. And on top of that, we've got a 12, 13, 14, 15. We've got a 16-hour time difference, right?
Yes.
So it's 8 p.m. here in New York City. It is noon in Sydney. So it really did take months for us to put it together, but I'm just so happy that we're chatting now. So thank you. Yeah.
But I send greetings from the future because we are Monday and you're Sunday at the moment. So we live ahead of your time.
You know, I always knew that time didn't mean to God what it meant to us. And so this is really just perfect.
It's very true.
Adrian, you've had this incredible journey where you started in the corporate world. You've worked in nonprofits. You've worked in faith tech companies. You've planted churches. You've been on staff at churches and you have these great ministries. And it's easy for me to see how God's woven all that together to bring you to this place that it feels like you're really, really positioned to catalyze something where you are in Sydney and in your broader region. But I'd love to go on that journey a little bit with you. Can you talk about that time when you were at Deloitte? So not only were you in corporate, you were at a firm that was like, if you were an accountant or if you're a consulting person, that's like the pinnacle, right? That's like the dream job to work at Deloitte. Can you talk about what made you decide to go from that to full-time ministry?
It's a great question. And I still ask myself that question sometimes, at different moments. I grew up in a very academic environment, kind of like similar to a lot of, migrant kids in Western countries, really. My dad is from Hong Kong originally, was the first in his family to leave the country, came to Australia in the late 70s. And kind of that classic story of, came with the clothes on his back and a small suitcase and just built a legacy, from the ground up. And so I think that kind of work ethic, perform, succeed, provide, that was just always, part of my family script growing up. And so I grew up in the church, grew up, knowing God and loving Jesus. But the idea of having a life that, was not, for example, stable or lucrative was just not at all part of my thinking. It was, go to church, but pursue a great career so you can provide and build on the foundations that my parents have left for me. But during my late high school years, I had some great youth leaders, mentors, and also my older brother who, started to see something of, I guess you could say, a call of God in my life towards, vocational ministry. And look, I very much resisted that at first. And I just thought, why would I do that? I can do something much better with my life, make more money, have more respect. I think my view at the time, seeing the church leaders, at the churches that I grew up in was, no, I don't want to be that person. I don't want to be everyone's boss and be the punching bag of everyone in the church and all that kind of thing. But, over the years, I think that desire to serve God in that particular way just continued to grow and grow as I got involved in different types of ministry and church life. And so it became really clear probably, 2 years before I actually made that final decision. I already knew that that's what I needed to do. And so when it actually came time to pull the plug, and hand in my resignation, at Deloitte, it actually wasn't a hard decision. But it took quite a few years to get there for sure.
Wow. I can't believe your brother saw that in you. Like he called it. Right. And we hear that so often from folks in pastoral ministry is that someone sees the call in them, they sense the call, but they resist. And it takes a while for them to begin their ministry journey. So for you, did you leave your job, then search for your role in ministry, or did you leave your job knowing what you were going to do next?
Yeah, it was definitely the latter. But the way that it played out was, I did a double degree at university, commerce and law, and then got a job at Deloitte straight out of university. Also got married that first year out of university as well. Or college, as you guys call it in the States. But by that time, I already knew, like I said, that I wanted to be in ministry. And so it was actually very reluctantly worked at Deloitte, which sounds weird because, like you said, for a lot of people, that is the pinnacle, that's the dream. But for me, it was just like, this is not where I want to be long term. But it was almost out of a sense of like obedience, because I think what God was really impressing on my heart at the time was that I needed some level of, exposure or experience in the corporate world before I was ready actually for ministry. And he needed to kind of test my character in different ways. And so, those kind of close to 2 years that I spent at Deloitte, no shade on Deloitte, but I didn't particularly enjoy it, and it wasn't anyone's fault other than I just knew that that's not where I needed to be long term. But actually, I haven't shared this in many years now, but I actually remember during those 2 years at Deloitte, I was really wrestling with God. I'm like, what am I doing here? I'm not using my gifts. I should be doing something else. And I felt like actually God posed a question to me. And the question went something like this. I think God was saying to me, he said, Adrian, if I ask you to do this, like to stay at Deloitte and work in corporate tax for the rest of your life, would you be content? And my answer was, of course not. Like, no way. And the moment I answered the question that way, I knew that was actually the wrong answer, because obviously, which I now know, like obedience is success. Like that is the pinnacle of success as far as the Christian life is concerned. And so the important phrase was, if God asked me to do that, would I do it? And the answer was no. And so I actually need to like surrender that dream and that sense of calling towards ministry. I had to actually lay that down again. And I think it was actually not long after I actually finally resubmitted myself to God's will. After that happened, not long after, out of the blue, I was offered this role in ministry that was just so out of the blue that it was very clearly, God's leading. And so that's kind of the journey.
Wow. That's amazing and so powerful. So that first job that the Lord delivered to you, how did it feel? And did you feel like you were ready for it?
Yeah, I think, yes and no.
What was it? What was that first ministry job?
Yeah.
And how did it feel stepping into it?
Look, in many ways, it was a dream come true because it was what I'd been wanting, for so long. So I was employed as a youth and young adults pastor full time. And it was amazing because, the senior minister, and I've been in contact with him recently. His name's Larry Galbraith. He's one of the heroes of the faith. And I just owe so much, to him because he just gave me the best possible start, to ministry and pastoral leadership. He was just empowering, releasing, led brilliantly, just led this uncomplicated church that was just full of life, generosity, and just I think he gave me more rope than he should have. But just that's the way that he leads, just the way that, just incredibly trusting and empowering. And yeah, in some ways I felt really ready, but in other ways I felt in a funny way, undeserving of how much authority, I was given. And, we had a blast. I was there for 3.5 years. And like I said, just had a lot of fun, learned a lot, but Larry just really backed me and covered me. And it was an awesome way to begin my journey in ministry.
Yeah, that's amazing. Like so often that's not the story. So often people are working, whether it's in the church or in the corporate world, for someone who may not be prepared to lead them in that season of their career. So to begin your ministry journey in that way, I think is really awesome. Now, not long after that, you planted a church, right?
Yes. Yeah, that's right.
Talk about how you went from starting your very first job in ministry as a youth and young adult leader to then planting a church.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think one of the things that I've learned or realized quite recently is just how God will often, God always, like you said at the beginning, the way that we see time is not how God sees time. And he sees the end from the beginning and the beginning from the end. And so often there'll be little kind of like breadcrumbs or clues in your story right from the beginning that you don't understand what it's about until much later on. And so that was the case for me. And actually for me and my wife, like in the early days of our relationship, I was, 18, she was, 19 or whatever it was. We actually had a number of people, prophesy over us and kind of share that, they saw an image of, or a picture or whatever it was of you guys planting a church in a suburb called Chatswood. So it's, in the North Shore of Sydney, very affluent area, very multicultural, that kind of thing. And it was like 3 separate parties who all said the exact same thing. And so we thought, okay, there's something to this. There's no immediate next step for us. We're teenagers, not married, all that kind of thing. But we remember that. We kind of like tucked that away in our hearts. And then obviously I got married, and then I got this role as a youth and young adults pastor. And I didn't have an exit strategy. I wasn't like, okay, this is going to be the stepping stone to the next thing, because loving what we were doing and all that kind of thing. But probably after 2-3 years, like that, those words just started to resurface in our minds. And then at the same time, I started getting offered all these different roles in different churches. And I was like, what's going on here? Something seems to be stirring. And then in that whole process, God really made it clear that actually the time is now. Like those things that I spoke to you all those years ago, now is the time to actually step into it. And so obviously I sat down with Larry, our senior minister, and I said, hey, I think, God's beginning to lead us in that direction. And so we went on that journey together. And then long story short, this other church that we had some connection to, they approached me, one day, and they said, hey, we're thinking of planting a church out of our existing church, out of their church, their existing church. And the location that we're thinking of was Chatswood, the very specific place that God had spoken to us about many years ago. And they said, hey, we love you and your wife to come on board with us for a year, get to know our church, and then we'll send you out, to plant. And so again, it was just one of those God aligning right people, right time, right place. And that's how it all kind of unfolded.
Help me to understand what that moment was like for you. This was prophesied over you and your wife by multiple people. And then years later, it comes to pass. Like this to me is a fall down on your face moment. Like what was that like for you and your wife?
Yeah, it is taking me back now a little bit, and I'm glad you're asking these questions, because it is so important to not forget when God does those kinds of things. I think, again, what I've learned is that there is often a time lag between I guess you could call it the anointing and the appointing, right? The moment when actually you hear or you feel God speaking something of your destiny or your calling or your future, whatever you have, or whatever you call it. And I think in our limited thinking, we tend to think, okay, that means it's now. Like, okay, tomorrow I'm going to see that come to pass, and it's going to be the complete fulfillment of all of that. But there's often a time, like same with, David being the most obvious example, like he was anointed with the authority and with that future, but actually it was many years before he stepped into that. Same with people like Joseph and whatnot. He was a dreamer. He actually had those gifts in him from a very young age, but there was so much character that needed to be tested before he could step into that. And so I think it was the same in a sense that it was obviously very surreal, because actually just to rewind a little bit, what happened was, I was two and a bit years into my role as a youth and young adults pastor. And again, there was no desire. I wasn't looking for the next thing or anything like that, but I just out of nowhere started being approached and offered all these different jobs. And they were all kind of like, yeah, they sound kind of good, and there's elements that I like about all of them, but none of them just had that kind of, touch of God on it when you just know this is the thing. And then as I kind of turned down all those different opportunities, then when this last thing came, across my table, so to speak, it was just so clear that it was almost like all the spotlights were shining on this one thing. And it was surreal, because it was God's reminder to us that, do you remember what I said to you all those years ago? That was real. And I haven't forgotten about it, preparing you about it. I've been preparing you for it. And so it was a no-brainer. It was like, of course, like we have to step in. And obviously we had to say goodbye. And, that was sad and difficult in many ways, but also really beautiful. You want it to be hard to leave, a context, right? And that's what it was for us.
Wow. Thank you for sharing that. So I'd love to ask you some questions about Faith Tech. So you've been there for about a year and a half now. It's this global community of people who are in tech, who are following Christ. Now, I think when folks first hear about Faith Tech, they have questions, right? Like, are we talking about people who work at Google who happen to be followers, or are these people who want to work in tech?
Yeah, Faith Tech, I guess one of our taglines is we are a global tech community for Christ. And the beautiful thing about it is that obviously these days, tech is everything and everywhere. And so in some ways, the boundaries of who we are trying to connect with essentially don't exist. It's almost like an opt-in situation. If you feel like this is your community, if you have some level of affinity or interest in technology, we can be the place for you. And that's very much, my own story is the same. I work for Faith Tech, but I have no formal background in technology at all. I couldn't write a line of code to save my life. I don't know if I'm supposed to admit that.
That makes two of us.
Yeah, right. But I mean, thankfully these days you've got plenty of great tools that can do that for you as well. But I don't have any background in tech, formally. But what I do have is I've always been a futurist. I don't know if you've ever done strengths finders and those kinds of things.
Yeah,
but I always come up with futurist as number one. So I've always had an interest in what's next, emerging things, trends and all that kind of thing. So I feel an affinity, with tech community, and I can feel a part of it. And so, yeah, I mean, if you want to get into specifics, let's say with the Faith Tech Australia community, you've got, certainly people who are working in Google, Meta, all that kind of thing, people who are doing, who are, entrepreneurs who are kind of venturing into tech either as a side thing or they've done a complete shift. And then you've also got people who are working for large corporates who are in a tech department or tech division. And then everything in between. It's a real, it's a mixed bag. But I think the common ground is we love Jesus and we love technology, and we want those two worlds to not be like oil and water or even conflicting with one another, which often that's how they're pitted. Like these two things cannot coexist. So pick one. But the people that we tend to connect with is no, we have a passion for both. And how can we integrate the two? There must be a way. And that's kind of why Faith Tech exists.
That's really awesome. So you've also spent a couple years at Redeemer City to City, Australia. Now, Redeemer City to City, I think most people know, grew out of the Redeemer churches, grew out of Tim Keller's ministry here in New York. So it's a ministry that, being based in New York, that I'm really familiar with. I've spent a lot of time with the amazing leaders there. Tell me a little bit about your time there. You've been the assistant director of church planting. What has that been like for you, especially as someone who has been a church planter? Yeah,
well, I was going to start there because my connection with City to City first began as a planter. So like I said, my wife and I, we planted a church here in Sydney, and we actually spent a bit of time in New York before we planted. So we did a kind of 4-week international church planters intensive at the Redeemer offices, where we were trained as planters. And honestly, that was one of the most transformative experiences of my life, being in a cohort with, I think, maybe 35 church planters from around the world, all in really different contexts, but united by a shared, love for, obviously a love for Tim Keller, but a shared love. How do we contextualize the gospel into our cities? And so, it was an amazing time. And so I was a beneficiary of the ministry of City to City. And then, fast forward a couple of years later, then, City to City, set up operations in Australia, and then a role, became available to actually be a part of the church planting team. And I thought, hey, what a great, full circle moment in some ways to be a beneficiary first of the great work that City to City does, but then now able to help other planters as well. So have been doing that for the last couple of years, and it's been a lot of fun.
That's awesome. So you spent some time in New York, and you're part of this really global network, right, for church planting. Has that given you some insight into how church planting and the church in general might be a little different in Sydney than in other cities around the world?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. I this is something I quote often, and I've heard it third hand, so I hope it's not a misquote. But some of your listeners might be familiar with a guy called Ed Stetzer. So he's a very well-known missiologist. And apparently some years ago, I think quite a few years ago now, apparently he came to Sydney one time, and his comment or his observation was, he said that the church in Sydney is the most divided out of anywhere he's seen in the world, which is not a title that you want to have, right? So this is Sydney specifically. I know you asked about Australia, but I'll talk just about Sydney first. Sydney's where I've, born and raised. I've been in the church my whole life. And when I heard that, it broke my heart, because my experience of that has been exactly true. That's exactly what I've experienced. The church in Sydney is extremely well resourced. Like, we have some of the greatest, I would say, exports in the global church have come out of Sydney. Where you land in terms of denomination or whatever, you can probably find a hero, in your stream of Christianity that originates in Sydney in some form. And so we're extremely blessed in terms of resource and all that kind of thing. Certainly, per capita, and given the size of the population that we are. But the unfortunate side of that is that there has been a lot of infighting. I think there's, because there's almost, giants in so many different streams. It's like, well, if you're with us, then you can't be with those people. And if you believe this, then you can't associate with these people over here. And so there has been a lot of that. And I think that makes Sydney unique, not in a good way, But what I would say is, and I was actually chatting to someone recently about this who's from the States, but he's done a lot of ministry in Australia. And he observed this as well. And I said, I think that's spot on. What he observed was, I think in the last probably 10, 15 years, that is changing. And I think Tim Keller actually wrote a lot about this in terms of what he saw in New York and in terms of like seeing that tipping point of evangelism and real kind of, a shift happening in the spiritual landscape. A lot of that actually can be traced to when the church becomes more united, when actually the body starts to operate properly in a city, that's when then the church as a whole becomes more effective. And I think Sydney is now starting to go on that similar journey where there once was tribalism and silos and infighting. I think that is beginning to shift. Some of that is generational as well, but I think there are some really positive signs that is starting to, evolve. So I would answer that question that way. But the other thing I would say as well is that I think because of, globalization and just rapidly accelerating secularism, I would say that in some ways Australia is very similar to a lot of other Western nations as well, where it's like you probably have more in common between the major cities of different countries than you would a city in Australia compared to a regional town in Australia, if you know what I mean. So I think, say, New York and Sydney will be lots more similar compared to Sydney and, I don't know, a place called Wagga Wagga, which you probably would have never heard of. But I think it's all becoming very similar, I would say.
Well, I'm getting a geography lesson on Australia tonight. I've heard about Chadwith. I've heard about Sydney. I've now heard about Wagga Wagga. So thank you, Adrian. Divisiveness and conflict in the church, that's no surprise to any of us this side of heaven. But it's so encouraging to hear that there's been a tipping point and that you're in a season where that seems to be shifting. And what a beautiful season for you to be stepping back into ministry. So you've been in ministry. You haven't never stepped out of ministry since you stepped into it, but you've done these different things, right? Like being at City to City, being at Faith Tech. You're about to announce at the time of recording, you're about to announce a new role in ministry. So maybe can you talk about that?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. Like I said earlier, I think God always takes a long view, when he works in your life. And I think from a very young age, I've known that I've, been called to pastoral ministry and to lead a church. But over the last few years, I've kind of done more adjacent things, like you said, still in ministry, but not so much in the church space. But yeah, probably about 2 years ago, God started to, elbow me in the ribs again, if you like, and to say, hey, actually don't forget about, that call to lead or to plant a church. And it's probably 6 months prior to when we're speaking now. Basically, God reminded me specifically of that call to the city, to the city of Sydney and to the real kind of downtown urban core of Sydney is something that I've always really loved. And it has had a really special place in my heart. And so I just, both my wife and I started to discern that maybe God was calling us to plant a church in the city, right in the heart of Sydney City. And then almost at exactly the same time, which now we know is not a coincidence, one of my mentors and kind of key contacts in Sydney, she spoke to me and she said, hey, like her pastor, so she goes to a church right in the middle of Sydney, and her pastors were actually wanting to transition out for the last 18 months, but just couldn't find the right people to hand the church to. And so she said to me, I wonder whether you and your wife, Jess, are supposed to be the ones to take that on. So it was just a real providential set of circumstances. And it's a much longer story, that I can't get into now, but it was just very clear that actually God was calling us back into the city and not to plant a church from scratch, but actually to take on an existing church, which has had an amazing, 25 years of history, but is now at a bit of a kind of hinge moment where we're looking for new leadership to take it to a new place. So we're really excited. It's a great opportunity. Again, like I said, a church with really great bones and has done amazing work in Sydney in the past, a real pioneering church, with a great kind of creative spirit, just done lots of great things in the marketplace and all that kind of thing, but is now kind of ready for that new chapter. So yeah, we're excited and I'm looking forward to kind of having that dual, hat, which you would know very well, of, pastor and certainly pastor first, leading and loving a local congregation here in the city of Sydney, but also still doing the faith tech stuff, and having that kind of, marketplace, I guess you could call it, the kind of dual calling, which I've been really encouraged to see more and more people share that similar passion as well.
A pioneering church, that is absolutely perfect for you, Adrian. You have the heart of a technologist. You have the heart of an innovator. So this seems just perfect for you. Now, I've talked to enough church leaders and enough church planters to know that, of course, there are challenges with starting a brand new church from scratch, but there are equally challenges to stepping into something that's already been and carrying that mantle forward. So can you talk a little bit about just your sense of it going into this new season, things that you're excited about, things that maybe you feel like will be a challenge?
Yeah, for sure. That's a really great way to put it. I think, you've got challenges either way, right? Like you said, I think, and, having planted a church before and having been part of lots of church plants, I think, it takes a certain type of leader or a certain type of team to really thrive in a church plant context, to be really comfortable with a lot of ambiguity, have that ability to kind of, pull people together, cast vision, all that kind of thing. And obviously, what you don't have is resource, credibility, buildings, all that kind of thing. It can be a real challenge. And then I think with stepping to an existing church, you might have some of those resources. Maybe there's a bit of cash in the bank. You've got an existing team, all that kind of thing. But then there's history, and there could be, landmines that you've got to navigate, and you've got to steer an existing thing rather than getting something new up and running. And so I think, there's so many different variables, right? Like, I think it depends on the type of leader who's leading, and then the type of, leadership team that they're inheriting and all that kind of thing. But I think one of the big things, for myself and my wife, as we kind of explored this opportunity, whether this was the right fit, was like, I know that there's something of a pioneer innovator that kind of God has called me to be. And so I had to be really upfront with the church and with the board about that. I said, look, this is who I am. And the way that I would love to lead this church is, yes, we want to honor the past and really, preserve a lot of those kind of key values and DNA, which I really love about the church. But we want to bring the church into a whole new era. And, that could mean, that a lot of things actually end up changing, maybe not all at once, because I think as a pastor as well, there's wisdom required in how do we graciously lead people through change and through the grieving that often has to take place, especially with people that have been a part of the church in many years gone by, that have helped sow into the church as it currently is. It can be very unkind, to just go, hey, that's all dead now. We're now doing a new thing. You need to pastor people through it and care for them through that process. But nevertheless, for the church, actually, these are our intentions. We want to move the church forward. We want to break new ground. We want to actually push boundaries. I think when we realized that the church was actually not just open to that, but actually really hungry for that and waiting for that, that's when my wife and I knew actually, this is a green light. We can lead here in the way that we feel is honoring to God's call in our life and also honoring to the church and the people there. So it's a dance, definitely a bit of a dance, a lot of discernment required.
So when do you officially start?
So at the time of recording, it's Monday my time. So this coming Sunday, it's when it will be fully and publicly announced to the church and to everyone. And then I'll be officially, my wife and I officially commissioned as the new senior pastors on the 23rd of March. So that's when we'll kind of officially step into that role. Obviously, I'm kind of on team and on staff already, so starting to do some of the kind of background work and getting to know people and all that kind of thing. But 23rd of March is the kind of go live.
Wow, that's so exciting. So I'm on the team of elders of my local church in downtown New York City. And we brought on a new lead pastor in the fall of last year. So a few months ago. So what you're describing from your side, I've experienced from like the church side, like welcoming a new lead pastor and being excited and full of anticipation for a new chapter. And hearing you talk about it from your perspective is, it's just what you said, I think is exactly right. I think this church is going to be so blessed to have you and your wife step into this new season. And I'm so excited for you. I can't wait to follow you and your journey and to follow Pioneering Church. It sounds like really, really exciting things are ahead. God's doing a new thing in Sydney and in your life and in your church.
No, it's very true. And thanks for saying all that as well. And I'm really happy to hear that you guys founded a pastor, because I think last time we spoke, you said there was an ad out and you guys are looking for someone to step into that role. So that's exciting.
So we were without a lead pastor at our church for 2 years.
Wow.
And I mean, the Lord had something in it for all of us. We had to wait for the right person. But for those of us who were in leadership at the church, we all stepped up and even more fully into our ministry callings than we had previously. In his timing, all things, the Lord wastes nothing. Even in the times of waiting, we can look back and see that's what he had for us.
Yeah, I can testify to that as well. Certainly when I was growing up, I grew up in a kind of Chinese church, and probably similar in America where, Chinese churches, often it's the older kind of demographic that they would have, say, Cantonese or a Mandarin service, and then their kids would be part of the English ministry. And so I often grew up in these smaller kind of English congregations, and we never had a paid full-time minister growing up. And although, there was challenges associated with that, like you said, it was just this kind of all in, like everyone's pitching in. It's the body of Christ in action. And so I really saw that. And then more recently, one of the churches I was a part of, our pastors, they had always had this kind of sense from God that they were going to be in the US, and that they actually won the green card lottery one year. And part of that process is when you win that green card lottery, you've actually got to exit the country really quickly and then move in and all that kind of thing. So same with us, our church had no pastors for not quite as long as you guys, but for a long enough period. And it also coincided with one of the big lockdowns during the pandemic as well. So in some ways it was almost like we had all the odds stacked against us, but it was actually one of the strongest and most beautiful seasons for us as a church, because it just activated people in a way that would have never happened had the past remained or had we not been in lockdown. So I don't know, hopefully that encourages someone today as they're listening to this, maybe your church is not as resourced as you would like, or there's a gap or a vacancy, but actually that's an opportunity, a golden opportunity that God has given to perhaps you or people around you to go, hey, I wonder what's in me. What are the gifts? What are the latent gifts that God's put in me that actually now is the time to actually dust it off and step into it.
Wow, that's a beautiful encouragement. Thank you. Can we leave it with one last question? Born and raised in Sydney, it's the mission field for you and for your wife. But if you could be in any other city, which city would it be?
You're asking this because you know the answer. Is that right?
I hope I know the answer.
Yeah, because we've spoken a bit about this. So it's your city, New York. So, we've just had this weird, tie to New York where, when we were engaged, so we had some friends, us who were here in Sydney, and they were actually, on their way to New York to plant a church, in New York. And when we were engaged, they sat down with us and said, hey, would you guys consider, coming along with us? And we were so thrilled by, the opportunity to do that. We actually changed our honeymoon plan so that we would end up in New York for our honeymoon.
No way.
And almost double up as a scouting trip. And we love New York, but it just didn't feel like we were supposed to move there, at that point in time. But then, over the next couple of years, we kept ending up in New York. Like I said, we spent weeks there doing the city to city intensive. And then we went there with my family, and we've just my cousin lives in New York. We've just had this connection with New York. I would love to be back. And who knows, maybe one day it will happen. I don't know, but it's an easy answer to your question. It's New York for sure.
Awesome. Well, maybe I'll be interviewing you in the next season of your ministry live here in New York City.
Nice. Who knows? Well, watch this space.
Thank you for tuning in to the Faithly Stories podcast. We pray this episode gave you the encouragement you needed to continue on your journey. The Faithly Stories podcast is brought to you by Faithly, an online community committed to empowering church leaders, pastors, staff, and volunteers. The Faithly digital platform offers innovative and practical tools and resources to enhance connection, foster collaboration, and promote growth within the church and ministry space. Remember to subscribe, rate, and review our podcast to help reach more listeners like you. Stay tuned for more uplifting tales from the front lines of ministry on the Faithly podcast. Stay bold, stay faithful, and never underestimate the power of your own story.